Welcome everyone to GeoHug. Happy Friday. Today's rock star is David Purdy. So Dave's a geoscientist with the Geological Survey of Queensland, and he's currently working on a number of projects around Mount Isa and Eastern Queensland. But today we brought him on to talk about the work that they undertook in the Thomson Orogen. So there's a heap of different work done, a lot of collaboration. So I'm really keen to hear what they all got up to and what they found. So thanks so much again, Dave. I'm so grateful that you're here.
All right. Yeah, it's often useful and interesting at the end of a big project to sort of step back and think about how little was known before you started and just how much you've added to the knowledge base. And that's particularly true for the various Thomson Orogen projects, because not only were they running for a very long time, albeit sort of on and off and in parallel with other projects, but because there was so little known before any of these started. So what I wanted to step through today is, I guess, my take on some of the more interesting things that we learned about the Thomson, and I wanted to express those, I guess, with the narrative of how the different projects developed, or my perspective on that. There's a lot of different organisations involved, and I've listed off the main ones down here, but within those, many different people over the different projects. So for anyone not familiar with Eastern Australian geology, the Thomson Orogen sits here. It occupies a huge portion of central and southern Queensland, and extending down into northern New South Wales. And it's a large and important component of the Tasmanides, this sort of collage or collection of orogenic belts that developed along the eastern margin of Australia in the Paleozoic and into the Mesozoic as well. So over the years, there's been a lot of various sort of boundaries drawn for the Thomson Orogen, but this is sort of a fairly accepted one today. And the key thing about the Thomson is that we don't know a lot about it because it's mostly covered by younger sedimentary basins. So the outcropping part, which is shown in red here, is really restricted to the northeastern corner. There's some little outcrops down in southern Queensland around Eulo, and then in New South Wales, there's the Tibooburra and Warratta inliers. But the remainder of it, this huge expanse, is all covered. And it's covered by a series of basins. So there's a Devonian system. This is the Adavale Basin, Oregon Trough and Barolga Trough. Overlying that, the Bowen Basin, Galilee Basin, and Cooper Basin. And then overlying everything is the Eromanga and the Surat down here in the southeast. So we're interested in the Thomson Orogen for a couple of reasons. One, it occupies this interesting time and space between the older Proterozoic North Australian craton to the west and the younger New England Orogen in the east. But also the outcropping rocks host a lot of known mineralisation, and there's a lot of different styles expressed in the outcropping rocks. So we're interested to see what the potential is for mineralisation in some of those, some of the covered area. The projects in the Thomson really started in the mid-2000s, I think around 2006, when the New South Wales Survey were working on a project down here. We at the GSQ did some geophysics in 2011, and that's this maroon coloured outline area that you see here. And it was around that time that I was working with Coralie Segal and Scott Fine at QUT, and we were getting out petroleum exploration drill cores that have intersected basement down here in the southwestern corner. And we're looking at the granites there. And Coralie was looking at them to work out the heat production potential of those and whether they were associated with the major thermal anomaly down in that area. And it was at that time that I sort of realised how little was known about the Thomson, but we had this great resource, all these petroleum exploration drill cores that we could study and find out more about it. So that's where my interest started and how I started to get involved. For the GSQ, our first step was to do a review of the Thomson Orogen in Queensland, and we published this record. So this sort of is everything that was known about the Thomson in Queensland. So all the geology of the outcropping area, what we knew about the geology of the covered area, mineralisation, and different hypotheses about sort of the tectonic development of the Thomson Orogen in the context of the Tasmanides. So this is probably a little bit out of date now, but I'd hope that it's still a good starting point for anyone working in the area. We didn't know anything about the Thomson when we started, so we would have loved to have a document like this that put everything together as a starting point. Okay, so I mentioned the historic drill cores. They're a really valuable resource, and yes, thanks to the federal government in the 1950s and 1960s that was subsidising petroleum exploration companies to drill to basement and to recover core from basement. So there's a lot of drill holes that intersect the Thomson Orogen in Queensland. There's about 1,300, but of those, we have only about 100 or so where drill cores are available to study, and they're stored out at our exploration data centre at Zircon. So we had a look at all the basement intersections and compiled up information for those. And what we found is that the Thomson Orogen is dominated by metasedimentary rocks. So this just shows you the very basic level lithological divisions. Dominated by metasedimentary rocks. There's some metavolcanic rocks, and there's also a lot of intrusive rocks. And in some cases, like down here in the southwest corner, they form sort of batholithic scale accumulations. Here's an example of one of the drill cores. This is GSQ Eromanga 1. And here you go from the Eromanga Basin, grading down into a conglomerate. Here's the unconformity somewhere around here. And then you're down into the Thomson Orogen. And in this case, it's represented by low-grade, fine-grained metasandstone, metasiltstone type sequence. And that's a pretty common lithology for what we are seeing in the Thomson. So we compiled all this information up into a database of all the drill holes, and that gives you all the information about the basement lithology and a validated depth to basement. And one of the things we used that for was to create a depth to Thomson Orogen surface. So that's from the validated depth to basement in those drill holes. And we also supplemented it in some areas like here, this area here, we have the Belliando Basin. There's no drilling there, so we supplemented that with very basic interpretation of seismic profiles just to get some more detail for that surface. We had a bit of a crack at dividing off, I guess, rock units amongst all the drill cores that we looked at. We did that mainly because we thought that a lot of the rocks correlated with known units in the Warburton Basin out to the west, things like the Inaminka Formation, for example. So here's some examples of the rocks. Right out in the west, you get a lot of fluvial and shallow marine sediments. So here's a nice conglomerate from Batuta. There's some carbonates out in the west as well, and there's also some red bed sandstones. Then as you move into more into the central Thomson, you get these fine-grained metasandstones and metasiltstones dominating. There's also some finer-grained pyritic sediments as well. And then in the Kneebine Ridge area, this area here, which is interpreted as a continuation of the Anarchy province down into southern Queensland, you get higher grade and multiply deformed politic and Semitic metasediments in that area. Okay, so as we were going, we were sampling all these cores for detrital Zircon Geochronology, which was done mainly by Andrew and Nat at GA. And what we found is two very distinct detrital Zircon signatures. Here's the location of all our samples, mainly drill cores, but we supplemented that with some outcropping rocks as well. And so the first signature is the most widespread, and this is pretty common in Eastern Australia. People call it the Pacific Gondwana signature. It's dominated by zircons in the 500 to about 650 MA range, with subordinate populations at sort of 900 to 1300. This is the group that people call Grenvillian aged zircons. And this signature is pretty common. We found it right throughout the covered part of the Thomson and also in the outcropping rocks. The other signature, which is more restricted, we see this one along the margin of the North Australian craton here and in some outcropping rocks like the Barthampton metamorphics, is totally dominated by these Grenvillian aged zircons from 900 to 1300 MA with much older maximum depositional age as well. We called this signature the Sin-Peterman signature because it's similar to what people have described in Central Australian basins like the Igneous, when during the Peterman orogeny, when the Musgrave province was being uplifted, you had all this Grenvillian aged detritus being shed off into the adjacent basins. Another thing I'll just point out as well, with the Pacific Gondwana signature in the Thomson, you see that it's dominated by this 580 MA peak. I think that's a difference to what you see in the Lachlan Orogen, which is more dominated by peaks around 495 or 500. So in the Thomson, although our maximum depositional ages are around 500, we're only getting a few grains at that age. It's not a major population. So we put all of that data together with stuff from Central Australian basins and also more outcropping rocks and things from the Southern Tomson Orogen. We came up with this general model, and it's sort of similar to what Chris Ferguson found in that he had observed those two spectra in outcropping rocks, and we were surprised to see it all the way across the whole covered part of the Thomson as well. So what we see is this transition from this almost unimodal Grenvillian aged populations to the Pacific Gondwana signature in the early Ordovician. So these rocks were deposited during the Larapinta event, so a major extensional event during which all of the Central Australian basins were connected, and we suggest that extended right over into Eastern Australia, into the Thomson Orogen as well. So that's what we found out about the metasedimentary rocks. We also had a good look at all the igneous rocks in the covered part of the Thomson and outcropping Thomson as well. So all the stars here are samples that we analysed and other people analysed as part of these projects. We had a look at some of these little outcrops down around Eulo, and because there's not much out there, they're all signposted. So it makes it really easy to find the outcrops down there. Here's some examples of some of the rocks. So they're mostly S-type granites. Currawinga, this one here is an I-type. The Granite Springs granite is a pretty interesting unit. It's the most extensive, and we spent a bit of extra time down there having a good look at it and compiled a lot of information into this report. So if you want to know anything about the Granite Springs granite, it's all in here. We also sampled a lot of igneous rocks from drill cores, and there's quite a bit of variation. Things like this altered rhyolitic ignimbrite from Adria Downs 1, nicer looking flat-lying ignimbrite in Gumbardo. There's also finer grained granites and granodiorites right through to coarse grained altered granites. So we again did a lot of geochronology on all these rocks, and this is all the emplacement ages you can see here. And you can see that they group off into different age ranges pretty nicely. We only had one Cambrian rock, which was from Adria Downs, way out in the west here. Then there's a grouping of a lot of Ordovician igneous rocks, a big grouping of Silurian, and then sort of trailing off through the Devonian. So that's the emplacement ages. And then this plot here shows you all of the individual ages for each of the samples. So I mentioned there's some S types, and that's reflected pretty well in here, where you see a lot of inheritance in these rocks. And in broad terms, that inheritance reflects what we saw in the metasediments. So a lot of grains in the 500 to 650 MA bracket, and a lot of grains in the 900 to 1300 age range. So with the igneous rocks, we also thought that we might be able to learn something about the compositional nature of the deeper crust below the Thomson Orogen, because in seismic, you can see in the deep seismic profiles, you can see that the Thomson Orogen just occupies the upper part of the crust, but there's this lower part that's fairly distinctive, and people have had various sort of guesses as to what the composition of that is. And amongst the different models, which I showed in the background here, there's sort of 3 end members. One is that it comprises oceanic crust that developed during and after Rhodinia breakup. And the other 2 hypotheses are that it comprises continental crust, either a extended Mount Isa province crust or extended Musgrave province crust. So we thought we could assess these hypotheses by taking specifically the I-type igneous rocks that we dated, and collect oxygen and hafnium isotopes from the zircons that we dated. And the results were pretty interesting. For example, for the oxygen isotopic composition, we see a very convoluted trend. I wasn't really expecting to see a trend in the data at all, so it's nice to see that. And in some ways, inflections in this trend correlate with known major events. So, for example, the opening of the Adavale Basin here in the early Devonian correlates with the most mantle-like oxygen composition. So anything around 5 is considered mantle-like. And then as you sort of move on in time towards this compressional event, the compositions become more crustal, more supercrustal with time. The hafnium isotopic data, and this is epsilon hafnium versus age, it's a little bit different. There might be more to pull out from this, but in general terms, we just see this trend from highly evolved compositions in the older rocks down here through to juvenile compositions in the younger rocks. And that possibly just reflects the importance of extension or ongoing extension in this area through time, and perhaps the access to different crustal levels. We're also fortunate to sample 2 igneous rocks from the same drill hole. So for Carlo 1, we sampled felsic ignebrite from the basement, from the Thomson Orogen itself, and that has the most evolved compositions of all the rocks. And we also sampled a felsic ignebrite from the base of the Adavale Basin, higher up in the same hole, and you can see that has a much more juvenile composition. So for that hole, at least, we can sort of rule out spatial variations causing these differences in epsilon hafnium values. So going back to these hypotheses, we then calculated model ages for all of those analyses. Here's the results here. So all the Thomson samples are shown in red here, but if we just focus on the most mantle-like or the most juvenile analyses, which are shown in these red triangles, we get model ages that range between about 1,000 and 1,400 MA. So these model ages are the timing that the ultimate source of these rocks was separated from the mantle. So it's indicating the timing of a major crustal growth event, major addition of juvenile material to the crust. So we think about those ages in relation to these other hypotheses, it doesn't really fit in with any of them. So if that domain was oceanic crust, we'd be expecting model ages of around 850 MA because it's new crustal growth at that time. If it was extended continental crust, either Mount Isa or Musgrave province, then we'd be expecting much older model ages of around 1900 to 2200 MA, because that's the timing of major crustal growth events in those terrains. You can see data for those here. So our model ages don't really fit with any of those, and it leads us to the suggestion that what we have underneath the Thomson Orogen is a mixture. So a mixture of continental crust, probably the Musgrave province, extending into Eastern Australia, that's been underplated or sealed and diked by mafic material during Rodinia breakup. Okay. While all that Zircon work was going on, we also held a workshop in Brisbane, which was very successful. One thing we did learn from that is that a lot more people were interested in the Thomson Orogen than we thought, because we had a pretty good turnout. And out of that meeting came two major collaborative projects. One is the Southern Thomson project, which is a collaboration between GSQ, the New South Wales Survey, and GA. And the other was an ARC linkage grant project, which we called the Missing Link in the Tasmanides. And that was a collaboration between the two surveys, the University of Newcastle, UQ, and QUT. Okay, so the Southern Thomson. GSQ was already working down there to interpret the geophysics. We were also looking at the drill cores and the outcropping rocks down there, but this gave us a good opportunity to collaborate with the New South Wales Survey, and GA were really interested in being involved as well. Most people will know that we interact really well with New South Wales, and you know, Queensland often comes out on top of those interactions. So this plot just shows some of the different data sets we had to work with. I've mentioned a few times that there's not much outcrop down there, but we do have a basement high, which is called the Eulo Ridge, and that extends northeastwards into Queensland. There's not many drill holes in the area. Most of the drilling is focused in petroleum exploration areas up to the northeast. These blue symbols are all water bores, and we weren't really able to get a lot of useful information about basement lithologies anyway out of those. Again, all the seismics mainly located up to the northeast in the areas of deeper cover, but the magnetics and the gravity, which are both great data sets, were really useful in this work. So putting all that together, we came up with this basement geology interpretation map, and this is a simplified version that you can see here. This really sprung or built off the work that Rosemary Hegarty at the New South Wales Survey did early on, and we sort of continued that up into Queensland and made it a seamless map across the border. Lying on top of that is a structural interpretation that Michael Dublier was working on, and he identified different structural domains in the area based on different styles and ages of structures and things like that, and eventually sort of defined these two megafolds in the area. In putting all of that together, and with all the new geochronology that was coming in at the time as well, we made this time-space plot. Time-space plots are normally pretty boring, but I wanted to show this because it pulls out that there's sort of two major stratigraphic packages. One is this early Ordovician package that was deposited at the time of the Larapinta event I was talking about earlier. And that comprises things like the Warrata group and informal units in Queensland like the Thomson beds. So all these metasediments that we're seeing through the Thomson Orogen are in this sort of package. But overlying that is another major package, which includes things like the Louth volcanics, the Warrawina volcanics, and into Queensland, things like the Glenroy Formation. And the University of Newcastle, the geochronology they did was really useful in tying down the ages of the volcanics here and correlating these units with the Cobar Basin. We also got some more geochronology in Queensland, so we're able to suggest that rocks of this age extend right up into Queensland, possibly including the Timberry Hills volcanics, which some people might be familiar with from the Roma Shelf. So that's a very extensive package of rocks that we didn't really even know existed in Queensland, at least. We certainly weren't seeing rocks of that age through the central Thomson when we were doing all the sampling of those rocks undercover. So with GA involved and Ian Roach involved, one of the first things we did was a regional AEM survey over the Eulo Ridge area. You can see the lines associated with that survey here. They're spaced at 5 kilometre intervals. And that was really useful. Yes, in places the signal was killed off by aquifers and conductive sediments, but in a lot of places it told us about areas of shallow basement that we didn't know about. And here's a really good example of that. So in this little map here, you can see this little red blob here is the outcropping Granite Springs granite. And this AEM line is about 15 k's to the south of that. And you can see our interpretation here shows basement coming very close to the surface in a couple of places along this line. So without the AEM data, we would have had no idea that, that there was basement rocks that close to the surface in that area. So putting a lot of information together, we started to devise a stratigraphic drilling program. And on the map here, the stars show the final locations of the holes that we drilled in that program. In Queensland, we focused on the Eulo Ridge because it's an area of shallow cover and we thought it could be sort of within reach of mineral exploration. And the main goals of the drilling program were to test our basement geology interpretation map, find out what some of these different magnetic domains and magnetic features actually were in rock format, and to get a very basic understanding of if there is any mineralization economic potential in the area. So all of the results from all this drilling has been reported on, and today I just want to talk about one of the more interesting ones, which is GSQ Eulo 2. Here's the drill site just here. It's about 20 k's to the southeast of Eulo, and it's on the margin of this feature here, which is a highly magnetic domain that we originally thought was a magnetic granite or granodiorite or something. And when we looked at the AEM profiles over that area, we found this very discrete basement height that we didn't know about. So for comparison, this feature here is where the Eulo granite comes to the surface just next to Eulo Township. And when we saw this line, we thought, oh great, we can drill a fairly shallow hole here to intersect basement to test the AEM interpretation and find out what's down there in a fairly shallow hole. I should mention at each of the sites before drilling, we did a suite of geophysical methods and other methods for estimating the depth of basement. And in general terms, what we found is that refraction seismic was really good at locally determining depth of basement. So in this example for Eulo 2, you can see that was estimated at 49 to 55 meters. And we actually hit basement at 49 meters here. So here's the basement interval. We intersected about 20 meters of a volcaniclastic conglomerate that has an altered matrix. And then we were down into an altered dacitic ignimbrite, you can see through here. And we dated that and got an age of about 385 MA, which is fairly young, particularly for volcanics in that area, but it does correlate with some of the granites. For example, the Currawini granite is a similar age. You can see there's a lot of alteration in the ignimbrite, and we do see anomalous arsenic in places. In the other holes that we drilled in Queensland, we did find traces of chalcopyrite, galena, and in one of the holes, some native copper developed along fracture planes. So overall, I think it's pretty encouraging signs for mineralization in the area. There was a lot of other work going on at this time. So I just wanted to spend this slide going through a few things that I haven't talked about. And most of this is reported in GA records. So there's some reports on the cover thickness and things. There's a report on the AEM survey. This is an example of one of the borehole completion reports. So this has everything, all the information about each of the holes are recorded in these. There's an MT survey as well, which I haven't talked about at all. There was also a regional surface geochemistry project. This is an important one to look at if you're exploring in the region. There's also a report on mineralization in the far southern Thomson, right down in the southern part of the New South Wales part of the Thomson. And again, I think this is a really important thing to look at, even if you're exploring in Queensland, because it gives you at least one model to try and target with your exploration. There's also a lot of geochronology going on, as I mentioned, and this is the most recent report. It contains a lot of good and interesting data. So the other project that I talked about earlier was the missing link in the Tasmanides ARC linkage grant project. And the idea of this was to bring together what we were doing in the surveys and bring in the various universities to try and get a better handle on how the Tomson Orogen fits into the development of the Tasmanides and Eastern Australia. The outcome of this project ultimately was this special issue of the Australian Journal of Earth Sciences, and you can see the contents there. And there's a lot of good papers in there. Some of it we've already talked about, things like the basement geology map are in there, but people also took the oxygen and hafnium work, for example, a lot further in here and pulled a lot more out of that. There's also a lot more geochronology in here and correlations between various basins and things. And importantly, those dates for the Louth volcanics and Warrawina volcanics are reported in here. And they were really important at the time because particularly the Warrawina volcanics were considered to be much older than that. So it was really great to get those ages tied down in here. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize with a few key things that we learned about. From the historic drill cores, we learnt that the Thomson, or central Thomson at least, is dominated by these metasedimentary rocks. And in places, there's bathylitic scale granite accumulations. The detrital zircons showed us that those two main spectra that are identified in outcrop extend right across the Thomson. And we interpret a continuation of the Centralian Superbasin into Eastern Australia. The igneous zircons, we learnt that the oxygen isotopes are very sensitive to tectonic events, and that it seems like the deeper crust is a combination of thinned continental crust with syn rhodinia breakup, mafic dyson sills. From the geophysics, of course, we know that the geology is very complex in detail, but there is areas of shallow basement that we didn't know about, and we learned the best methods for determining depth to basement. The drilling, I guess unsurprisingly, taught us that the solid geology map needs a lot more constraints, but there is some economic potential down there in the southern Thomson. And in terms of the geology, there's a big component of the stratigraphy down there that's relatively young, late Silurian, early Devonian, that we didn't know about, and that extends a long way into Queensland. I've mentioned that there's a lot of people involved in this. I've listed off everyone I can think of here that was actually working on projects. But of course, there's a lot more than that, and you know, a lot of discussions with different people and a lot of help from different people over all the projects. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Dave. It's so cool to see so much like collaboration, even with the enemy states. It's good to see. Come through. What's your thoughts on the relationship between Macquarie Arc and the volcanics at the Southern Thomson, especially prospectivity?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because one of the hypotheses with the Warrawena volcanics that we're talking about was that they were part of the Macquarie Arc. So that geochronology kind of rules that out, unless there's parts of the Macquarie Arc that poke up through the Thomson in that southeastern corner, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah, Richard here. Thanks, Dave. That was terrific. And yeah, I would again comment. It was really brilliant to see how GSQ, New South Wales, and GA team just worked together. It was one team. You wouldn't have thought that we were three different organisations. It was marvellous to see. And one thing I was, really proud to see how you're working across the border, state borders, and sort of saying, look, if you drilled that hole and we drill this hole, there was none of this sort of competition. Everyone was really trying to understand the whole sort of Southern Thomson together. And I thought it was really good to see. So thanks, Dave, for leading the GSQ side of things. My question is, what do you think's next? What would help sort of kick it to the next level, Dave? Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of keen to see some more mineral exploration in the Queensland side of the border, obviously. There's a junior explorer down there at the moment who's primarily focused on geophysics, and there hasn't been much geochemical exploration in the Southern Thomson, or in the Queensland part of the Southern Thomson. So I kind of love to see some explorers get together and have a better look at those areas in Queensland and use some different methods. I know it's not easy, well, particularly with geochemistry, the amount of cover. But yeah, I'd like to see some different methods applied and a bit more exploration drilling in there.
There's been so many comments, great presentation, and it was good to be reminded how much good work was done in the Thomson with you guys. So thank you so much for covering this topic for us, and I had several requests to have it on, so thanks so much for doing that, and thanks everyone for joining, and yeah, have an awesome weekend. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks to whoever suggested talking about the Thomson, because I'd sort of forgotten about it, but it was really good to sort of reflect on how far we came with it. So, good.